Welcome to our webinar on Chinese Australian family history. My name's Bing.
And my name's Lisa.
We are reference librarians here at the National Library. We'd like to start by acknowledging Australia's First Nations peoples, the first Australians as the traditional owners and custodians of this land, and give respects to the elders, past and present, and through them to all Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people.
You may be joining us because you've heard family stories of a Chinese ancestor in Australia, or you've come across a document of a descendant with a Chinese name. Perhaps you've recently discovered a photograph of an ancestor, or even taken a DNA test, or simply just want to learn more about your Asian roots in Australia. Whatever your reason, we hope this webinar will get you started on researching your Chinese ancestors in Australia. Like any good family history research, you should start with yourself and work backwards. It is best to work from the known to the unknown. Start by writing your name, your full name, date and place of birth, followed by your parents' full name, date and place of birth, then your grandparents' full name, place of birth, and so forth. You might like to watch our 5-minute webinar on how to start your family history. For more information, visit our Getting Started page found on our Family History Research Guide.
To identify your Chinese ancestors in Australian records, you will need their names. This can be the most challenging part of your research if your ancestors arrived before the 1950s. Like so many immigrants from non-English speaking backgrounds, names may have been incorrectly transcribed, and there were so many different spelling variations in how names were recorded. Chinese names usually comprise 2 or 3 Chinese characters, sometimes 4. A family name goes before a given name. Chinese migrants may swap their names around to suit Western conventions, but if you are having no luck with finding official records using their names, try searching under their first names. Your Chinese ancestor could have also anglicized their first or family name, so keeping a record of different name variations is important. It is not uncommon to find Chinese personal names having an R or A in Australian records, such as Chee or Fong. This prefix doesn't have a meaning. It's added before a given name in spoken language to express familiarity. It is a very informal way to address a person, just like using a nickname. However, the prefix was often entered into documentation and in some cases combined with the given name to become one word. Children are normally given their father's family name, but a Chinese married woman may have kept their maiden name. To successfully check your family back to China, you will also need to identify your ancestors' Chinese names and the villages they originally came from. This can be difficult, but we will talk about some of the resources that might be helpful later in the presentation.
Once you have identified or collected all the possible names your ancestors may have used, you can start searching for records. Plan what records to access and where to locate them. Records created at the time of your ancestor was alive will be the most reliable. Our Family History Research Guide will provide you with a good starting point on what we hold and what resources you can access. State and territory libraries also hold a range of family history resources. Before we delve into useful resources, let us provide you with an overview of early Chinese migration to Australia to give you a better context of why and how your ancestors may have arrived in Australia.
The first people from China to settle in Australia were probably a very small group of settlers and domestic servants. Mai Sai-in is the first documented Chinese immigrant to Australia, although it is believed Chinese immigration may have occurred much earlier. Born in Canton, the now Guangdong province of China, Mai Sai-in, who was also known as Zhongxin, and a few other names arrived in New South Wales aboard the ship Laurel in 1818. In the late 1840s, Chinese labourers were transported to Australia on indentured labour contracts by British merchants under the so-called coolie trade as a response to labour shortage in Australia. The ship Nimrod brought the first group of 120 Chinese laborers to Sydney from Amoy, now known as Xiamen, on the 2nd of October 1848. After that, more and more ships carrying Chinese laborers arrived at different Australian ports. Amoy, or Xiamen, is located on the southeastern coast of China in the Fujian province, or Hokkien, as it was previously known. From 1845, it was a major departure port for transporting Chinese laborers overseas. Some of those earliest Chinese migrants were generally from Hokkien. From 1848 to the early 1850s, over 3,000 Chinese workers were transported to Australia to boost the labor force here. On arrival, they were hired to work in pastoral properties and rural areas. From 1852, the shipment of Chinese laborers was shifted to ports in other areas, such as Canton, Macau, and Hong Kong. Therefore, most Chinese migrants who arrived in 1850s and 1860s for the gold rush were from Canton, the now Guangdong province. This is an 1853 map of China held at the National Library. Canton is in South China, borders Hong Kong and Macau. The capital city of this province is also known as Canton, but most migrants came from villages in districts such as Si Yap that are outside the city. The majority of Chinese migrants returned to their home villages by the 1880s after the gold rush. By the time of Australian Federation, there were about 30,000 Chinese in Australia. The number of Chinese arrivals declined significantly in the first half of the 20th century, and in 1947, the Chinese population numbered some 12,000.
Perhaps the record that most people want to discover is the name of the ship their ancestors arrived on and when it arrived. Uncovering the reasons why your descendants migrated to Australia can often just be as fascinating. Did they arrive to try their luck in the New South Wales or Victorian goldfields? Were they part of the indentured Amoy labourers who worked on pastoral stations in the late 1840s to the early 1850s? Did they arrive as a crew member on board a ship? Passenger records can be a very useful source of information for family history research. Records could include the passenger's full name, date, place of arrival, name of the ship, age, occupation, country of origin, marital status, a wealth of information for any family historian. However, early records could be limited to the content and may be confined to the family name and just an initial with no given name or title such as Mr. or a Mrs. with no other information. This, of course, can make it difficult to confirm if the passenger record is the person you're searching for. As with any original historical record, mistakes occurred. This was even more prevalent in passengers from non-English speaking backgrounds. Names could have been misheard due to the transcriber not being familiar with Chinese names, or pieces of information could have been misheard. Passengers sometimes provided aliases and did not always know their age or were not truthful for various reasons to avoid law or military enlistment. As being mentioned earlier, it was customary for Chinese immigrants to provide their name first, followed by their given names. So document takers could have recorded passengers under their first name instead of their family name. There is a vast array of shipping and immigration records available. Before you start your research, it is best to have an understanding of how these records are arranged. Prior to 1924, the administration recording of shipping and passenger arrivals was the responsibility of Australian colonies or state. The surviving original records are now held at the State Archives or Public Records Office and are arranged by passenger type, such as an assisted passenger. This was when the passenger's fare was paid for by the government or by an employee or a family member. Or perhaps they were an unassisted passenger who paid their own fare. Or they could have arrived as a crew member on board a ship. These are just a few passenger record types. Some state archives, such as the Public Records Office of Victoria and the State Records Office of South Australia, have digitised historical passenger records and have made them freely available on their websites. Family history databases such as Ancestry and Find My Past have also digitised various Australian passenger arrival records. You can access these databases on site within the National Library building, or you may like to contact your local library to find out if they subscribe to these databases. From 1924, immigration became the responsibility of the Commonwealth Government. As a result, all subsequent records relating to immigration, passenger arrivals, departure records and naturalisation records are housed at the National Archives of Australia. The National Archives of Australia has published some excellent online guides. These detailed guides focus on records that would be of most interest to family historians and researchers of Chinese Australian history. There is also an abundance of records relating to entry, departure, alien registration, student records and other travel documentation that was housed to Chinese Australians during the colonial period through to the 20th century. These can be highly useful as they may contain Chinese and English names, as well as birthplaces or district of origin.
Before citizenship began in Australia on 26 January 1949, immigrants from non-British countries could apply for naturalisation. It was not compulsory, but it did offer incentives such as the right to vote and purchase land. Immigrants needed to be in the country for at least 5 years before they could apply to be naturalised. Naturalisation records often provide rich information for family historians tracing their Chinese-Australian roots. Generally, records include the full name, date, length of ship, country of origin, age, and occupation. Naturalisation records from 1904 became the Commonwealth's responsibility, and records are held at the National Archives. Pre-1904 naturalisation records for Victoria and South Australia are also held in the National Archives. You may like to do a name search via their catalogue for any digitised records. Records created before 1904 in New South Wales, Queensland, Western Australia and Tasmania are housed by the State Archives. For those whose ancestors were in New South Wales, the Chinese Naturalisation Database New South Wales 1857 to 1887, hosted by La Trobe University as part of the Chinese Heritage of Australian Federation project, may be useful. The university's Chinese Australian page brings together many useful databases and indexes, including a list of endangered Chinese labourers and employers identified in New South Wales 1828 to 1856. Explore their resources page to find out more. Certificates of exemption from the dictation test is a wonderful resource for anyone searching for Chinese immigrants from 1904 to 1959. These certificates were issued to Chinese people who departed Australia and wanted to return without having to take a dictation test. Once the certificate was issued, the immigrants have 3 years to return to Australia. Not only would the certificates contain a person's particulars, but it also includes a photograph and fingerprint. Certificates are held at the National Archive of Australia. Some are digitised. Here is an example of certificates for Flore Li Hang Gong found on their website. You can access an online index to Victoria certificate through the Chinese Australian Family Historians of Victoria.
Birth, deaths and marriage records are a vital part of any family history research. They can provide important details about your ancestor, such as a full name, birthplace, date, age, occupation, spouse name and family members. Historical death certificates for New South Wales, Queensland and Victoria will even identify where the deceased was born and how long they had been living in the colony. You never know if a hidden but important piece of information will be on a birth, death or marriage certificate. Certificates can be purchased from the relevant state or territory birth, deaths and marriage registry office. Search online to find websites. The National Library and state libraries hold historical birth, deaths and marriage indexes. Check out our Australian Birth, Deaths and Marriage Research Guide for more information. In addition to birth, deaths and marriage records, cemetery records, tombstones and burial plots can often provide additional details and may be inscribed in Chinese language. Within Australia, Dr. Kok Hu Jin is well known for his dedication to transcribing and interpreting Chinese language inscriptions on monuments and cemetery headstones. He has published a series of work which includes his histories, Chinese cemetery maps, indexes and names, birth, deaths and marriage dates, birthplaces and ancestral villages. His publications are held by many libraries and collecting institutions throughout Australia, and many of his indexes are freely available online through the Chinese in Australia page found on the Family Search website.
Electoral rolls can be a great way to find out more about your ancestors. You can find out the residential address of a person and help locate other family members living at the same address for a certain year. You could also find out the occupation of a person, which may prompt further investigation into business or company records. As mentioned earlier, Chinese immigrants needed to be naturalized before they could vote or be listed on any rolls. The voter also needed to be over 21. The age was lowered to 18 in 1973. Let's have a look at an example of an electoral roll. Australian Commonwealth electoral rolls up to 2008 are available from the National Library and state and territory libraries. Some electoral rolls have been digitized and accessible via the Ancestry and Find My Past databases, each providing different years. As mentioned earlier, you can access these databases on site in the National Library or contact your local library to find out if they subscribe to these databases. Post office directories can be useful as an alternative for electoral rolls, especially if your Chinese ancestors were not naturalized or able to vote. They were published annually and included a list of people by town, street name, occupation and business. We hold directories in print, microfiche and electronic format. You can find a list of directories by state and territory on our Family History Sources Guide, available from our Family History Research Guide. We have digitized the New South Wales Wise Post Office directories from 1887 to 1950 and have them freely accessible from home through Trove. Your state library may also have directories in their collection.
Newspapers can be a fantastic way to discover an array of information about an ancestor. You can search for a birth, death and marriage notice, employment or business details, discover residential addresses, find out if someone served in the war, find court cases, immigration and property purchases. Newspapers can also provide a great social history about the area and the time that they lived. This interview, published in the Adelaide Observer on the 7th of April 1888 with successful Chinese merchant Wei Li, explores topics such as Chinese migration, family structures, the poll tax, the Chinese labour market in Australia, and his public negotiations to supply Chinese labourers to the Daly River plantation in the Northern Territory. The Chinese Wesleyan Mission Minister in Adelaide, Reverend Hargraves, acts as an interpreter for this interview. It is a great reflection of issues and topics surrounding Chinese immigrants, such as the poll tax that was imposed on Chinese immigrants upon their arrival to Australia. Our newspaper collections include historic and modern newspapers, accessible online, as well as newspapers in microform and paper formats. You may like to check out our Australian newspapers and overseas newspapers research guide for more information. We not only hold mainstream Australian newspapers, but also multiple runs of Chinese community newspapers, which Bing will go into later. You can find out what we hold in our catalogue. Searches can be made by title or place of publication. If the name of a newspaper is known, search by title, such as Ballarat Courier, and use the drop-down button to select the title field and limit searches to newspapers. Click on the Find button. You will notice results can be refined using options located on the right side of the screen, such as decade. To locate newspapers, if a title is not known, type in a town, city, state or country, followed by the word newspapers. For example, Perth newspapers or Western Australian newspapers, and use the drop-down button to select newspapers. Then click on the Find button. You will find results can be limited using options located on the right side. You can even select newspapers in different languages. One of our fantastic resources for family history research is Trove. You can search the books and libraries category in Trove to find out if a library closer to you holds a newspaper title that you're after. For example, if I was searching for a Darwin newspaper but didn't know the title, you could simply type Darwin newspaper into the books and libraries category and click on Find. Limit the decade that you're after and select the relevant record and scroll down to find a list of libraries in Australia that hold this title. Trove has also digitised newspapers. Begin with a simple name search such as An Chang Gon or An Chang Gong plus Launceston. Watch our short Getting Started video on Trove via the Trove Help page for search tips.
The Chinese communities in Australia started to publish newspapers of their own voices in the 1890s. Some earliest Chinese language newspapers include the Chinese Australian Herald, the first major Chinese newspaper in Australia, which was published between 1894 and 1923 in Sydney. The Chunwan newspapers, which was also published in Sydney, and Melbourne's first major Chinese newspaper, the Chinese Times, which runs from 1902 to 1922. There's a wealth of information about the individual and collective lives of Chinese immigrants in these newspapers. Trove offers access to digitized versions of these earliest Chinese language newspapers. It allows you to browse the newspapers online and search within the newspapers. Unlike many traditional Western newspapers, they are less likely to publish family notices. But occasionally, death notices were placed in these newspapers to notify the community of the death of a person, especially when the person was a notable member of the community. Major Chinese newspapers like the Chunwan Times were active community organizations. They spoke for the community, organized fundraising activities to support their ancestral homeland in China, and performed all kinds of social functions to assist the community in various ways. You will find numerous business notices, shipping timetables, local news articles, and various community notices containing information on people's names and villages of origin. You will be pleased to know that the Chunwan Times has been indexed in English, which allows you to search without knowing the Chinese language. The Chunwan newspaper indexed is also available through the La Trobe University website.
Chinese Australians have served in Australia Defence Forces and made noteworthy contributions during conflicts such as the Boer War, World War I and World War II, Korean and Vietnam War. There is a long record of Australians with Chinese ancestry serving in Defence Forces. Even prior to the 20th century, at a time when Australian-born children of Chinese settlers faced significant racial intolerance, persecution and social exclusion. Although the presence of Chinese Australians throughout Australia may not be as well known to the general Australian public, websites such as World War II Chinese Australian Soldiers Honour Roll, created by the Chinese Museum, and the Chinese Anzacs, published by the Australian War Memorial, honours these servicemen and women. Defence Service records can be accessed from the National Archives of Australia. Simply visit their website and type in the name of the serviceman or woman into the record search box. You may even find a record that you're after is digitised and freely available online. Due to the prejudice some Chinese Australians faced when trying to enlist, they may have anglicised their names or used family name of their mother if they were European. This is the reason why it can be useful to keep a list of name variations for your ancestors to keep in mind as you search. There are a number of wonderful works that capture the Chinese Australians' wartime. Search our Books and Libraries category in Trove to find a library closer to you that holds these books or similar ones.
The National Library is a great place to start your family history research, not only because we provide access to the many archival records mentioned earlier, but also because of our strong published and unpublished collections that help you gain a better understanding of the Chinese community, their shared memories, and the cultural and historical context that may influence your research. The library has an excellent collection of published family histories and secondary sources created by scholars, historians, and Chinese Australian genealogy organizations. For example, the multi-volume Cantonese students' record by Dr. Su Mingxian. In the early 20th century, young Chinese were allowed to come to Australia to study. Most who came were children or relatives of people already living in Australia and were mostly Cantonese. These books cover biographical information of each student, their family connections in Australia, copies of original records such as students' passports and indexes to the student. This is the first volume of the set, focusing on students coming from the Zhongshan district of Canton. The library also offers a range of resources about the ancestral homelands of Chinese immigrants, including local gazetteers, journals, newspapers, and maps. You may also be interested in exploring the Chinese oral history and manuscripts collections. They provide a unique insight into the lives and experiences of Chinese Australian people. Our oral history collection includes interviews with family members of a number of first-generation migrants. One such interview is with Joyce Lee, who was born in 1916. She was the daughter of Jinjiang Henry, the late business owner of Henry and Company. In her interview, she shared memories of her father, who first mined for tin at Wheelbarrow in Tasmania and then established his wholesale and retail fruit and vegetable business. The story of businessman William Liu, born in 1893, is just another example. He described his return to Australia in 1909 from Hong Kong. He speaks of his studies, the white Australian policy, and his involvement with community matters around Melbourne. This oral history interview and its transcript is digitized and available through Trove.
Now, back to my 1912 to 1914 years in Melbourne. It was very much like I was back in my father's relatives' Taisan village, T-I-I-S-I-N village. There, you could say I had led a peasant's life, a village peasant's life, very much as if I was born there. I went there, couldn't speak English. Within months, I suppose a year or so, I began to feel, one of them. And so much so, and the dialect that I learned at Taisan was mostly spoken in Melbourne, in the Chinese community. So I was in my element.
Our manuscripts collections contain invaluable materials such as personal papers, correspondence, diaries, and more. The letter books of Chou Hong Chou, including 7 volumes of letters by the Chinese missionary. He was born in China in about 1853 and came to Ballarat in 1850s with his father, who was also a missionary. The library's pictures collection, comprising photographs, prints, drawings, paintings, postcards, and objects, much of it digitized, document the various aspects of lives of Chinese Australians. You can find historical images of buildings, such as the Chinese boarding house owned by William Assack in Gawagong, New South Wales, 1872, and John Alu's Chinese restaurant in Ballarat. Different Chinese huts, and of course Chinatowns. You can also find images that document events such as the Chinese Parade in 1901, Chinese funeral, and a puppet show to celebrate the Chinese New Year. There are also portrait photographs of many Chinese migrants.
As a case study, we'll explore the family history of Chee and Mary Nomchong, pictured here in 1930. Chee and Bu married in 1887 in Hong Kong. This was Chee second marriage. His eldest son George was the son of his first wife who died in China. We hold a photograph of Bu wedding dress, seen here modelled by her daughter Ellen, who was also known as Nell. Shortly after their marriage, the newlyweds arrived in Australia and settled in Braidwood in New South Wales in 1887. Prior to this, Chee had been living in California and came to Australia to join his brother Shu Fun in 1877. His brother was a storekeeper on the Mongalo goldfields, located just outside of Braidwood, and encouraged Chee to move to Australia. Chee agreed, and the two brothers soon became business partners in Mongalo. Chee was naturalised in 1882. The original record is held at the State Records of New South Wales, but we hold copies of New South Wales naturalisation certificates in microfilm format as part of the State Records of New South Wales Archives Resource Collection. As you can see, his family name was documented as Doc and his first name as Chee. Chee had returned to China in 1886 to marry Bu Zhang. Like his brother Shu Fun, Chee anglicised his surname from Ng to Nomchong. His wife Bu Gu echoed this and changed her name to Mary Nomchong. The Nomchong name means southern prosperity, and it is believed that this was the name of the business which Shu Fun later adopted as his surname. Chee took over the Mongalo store later and sold the business after his brother died and established a store in Braidwood. According to articles found on our archived websites in Trove, this store remained in the Nomchong family until 1980. You can discover listings for the store in Wallace Street in Wise's New South Wales post office directories up until the 1950s. We hold a photograph of the business taken in 1940. Those of you who know Braidwood will recognise this building on the corner of Wallace Street. The sign reads M. Nomchong, and according to this 1930 article, the company owners were Mary and Chee and their children Paul, Leopold and Mary M. Nomchong. Chee and Mary had 14 children in Braidwood, raising 13 children into adulthood. Chee son George, from his first marriage, remained in China with his grandparents for many years and reunited with his family in Australia as an adult. Although Chee was naturalised in 1882, George was not exempt from the Immigration Act 1901. Consequently, George was deported back to China. A fantastic 2014 blog by Kate Bagnall titled Celestial City, Misunderstanding of the Administration of Immigration Restriction, available in the archived website section in Trove, outlines how Chee made several requests to the Australian government that his son be allowed back into the country, and even presented a large petition signed by the residents of Braidwood asking for special considerations to be given. George was eventually issued with a certificate exemption from the dictation test in 1913, which was extended several times. He remained in Australia until his death in 1970. The Dr. Sue Ming Xian books, mentioned by Bing earlier, reveal an article on Chee Doc held in the Cantonese Student Archives. According to this article, Chee Doc had applied for a Chinese student passport visa in 1921 for his grandson Thomas Nomchong, who was George's son. From these documents, Bing was able to determine Chee Doc's original Chinese family name was in fact Wu. In addition to this, Bing uncovered the family originated from the small village of Wenlu in the Xinwei district of Guangdong, China, an unexpected but invaluable find. Chee Doc and Mary's individual death notices demonstrated how much they were loved and respected in the community. Even in 1977, the Braidwood Historical Society celebrated the centenary of Chee's arrival to the town by organising a community dinner on the 19th of November 1977. They presented each guest with a souvenir booklet entitled The Centenary of Nomchong Family in Braidwood 1887 to 1977. There is a wonderful 4-page article in the Talaganda Times on the 23rd November 1977 about the dinner. The article provides a great write-up about the Nomchong's family arrival to Australia and their history in Braidwood. Undeniably, this Chinese immigrant family was embraced by the town and enriched the community by sharing their cultural heritage. This is just one story across Australia. We would be interested in hearing your family's immigrant stories. For more information, visit our Collecting Chinese Australian Stories page.
We have really only been able to scratch the surface, but we hope that this has been helpful to anyone getting started. If you need help moving forward, there are a number of excellent associations with a great deal of expertise, such as Chinese Australian Family Historians of Victoria, Australian Chinese Community Association of New South Wales, Chinese Australian Historical Societies. We also have our own art librarian service. While we can't do extensive or ongoing research for you, we can provide research assistance if you hit a brick wall. Happy researching?